Thank you very much indeed, John. It's great to be back here at another packed crowd event. Given that John has just told a room full of CSR professionals that the CSR function, and indeed the PR function, I think, is dead, rest assured I will give you all a right to reply, and I'll make sure we've got enough time for your questions at the end. We usually go for about 10 minutes. I'll give us about 15 minutes to get some of your questions in. But it has been a sobering message, not just for, I guess, those who work in the CSR teams, but for management in business to get their acts together, to get their priorities right. We will get to the panel in just a sec. Another fantastic panel that Jim and his team have pulled together. By all accounts, 4 connected leaders. Something Jim tells me was pretty hard to pull together, an indication of how much in the minority, I guess, connected leaders really are. And we'll find out exactly what a connected leader is or means to our panelists tonight. There is much to talk about. Once again, I find myself moderating an event which touches on many of the important pieces and issues that we've discussed on this stage over the past year or so. Diversity, the killer app, radical openness, valuing nature, the reinvention of marketing with Keith Weed from Unilever. I don't know if you were here for that one. Integrated thinking. Now, if I've got this right, connected leaders are those who actively engage with society to address all of the above. So we will no doubt talk about all of it in some shape or form this evening. Of course, the news is full, as we just heard from John, of where companies are getting it wrong, be it big oil, be it the tax shaming of Google, of Amazon, of Starbucks, the handling of VW's emissions scandal, the banks and the way they've handled themselves, the list goes on. I'm going to have a very brief chat with each guest, and then we'll open it up to our panel discussion before coming to you. I want to start with Helena Morrissey, who leads Newton Asset Management. Among many other things, Helen is founder of the 30% Club and chair of Opportunity Now, Business in the Community's Gender Diversity Campaign. You've also argued, Helena, that the financial community is sleepwalking into an environmental crisis. I'd like to talk a little bit about that in a moment. What makes, Helena, do you think, a connected leader?
Well, I think John touched on it right at the end of your talk, and it's obviously covered in your book, this issue about engagement and inclusion. I think one of the challenges when we listen, and it all seems, frankly, probably to all the people in this room, obviously very insightful, but also obvious. The question is, why isn't everybody connected? Why is it so difficult to pull a panel together of 4 people who care about this? I had a meeting last week with Christiana Figueres, who obviously emerged triumphant from Paris, and she made the connection, actually. She suggested to me, look, isn't there something interesting in terms of a parallel between, for so long everyone could see the climate change issue, for so long everyone could see the need for better gender equality in business, and suddenly we get a breakthrough. What is it about, what has occurred to create the breakthrough? Because I think it's really important today that, I hear you, John, that we don't want to come up with a sort of like glib solution, but it would be great to have some pointers, some seeds. Yeah. And the point was that when people realize it's in their own interests, and I'm afraid I've come to the conclusion a bit that although we might like to think that everybody's altruistic and thinks of everybody else, then ultimately you might only be able to break the vicious cycle that John alludes to, the perennial tendency of businesses to disconnect from society, by having us realize, and perhaps we can in today's transparent world, that it's in our interest to do the right thing.
And connected leaders have to go out on a limb. They have to take risk, right? I mean, how much of a risk do you feel you should take when often you are taking a risk with the business for which you're working?
Well, I guess it all depends on what you think of your role in life as a business leader, because I think it's very clear that businesses today that are going to be successful in a sustainable way, yes, of course, you're trying to do a good job for customers and for shareholders, but actually you're also trying to help use your resources to help solve some of the world's and the society's problems. Now, not everybody thinks like that. Their starting point isn't that. So for me, I don't think of it as risky leading the way I lead, because that's just how I am and how I'm sure everybody on this panel is, and a lot of you in the audience. But I know that not everybody thinks that way. And that's, I think, the problem where I come back to, that ultimately if they don't buy into it from a sort of moral or a sort of a belief set, then actually realizing this is the only way to run a successful business is what we're going to have to change the dialogue to, the narrative to.
Okay, we will no doubt come back to this. Sasha Romanovic is the newly appointed CEO of Grant Thornton UK, regarded by many as a next generation leader. You're an active tweeter, which of course allows me, allows us, allows your organization, very importantly, to see what you're thinking. Transparency, I think, is a very important piece of this. Sasha actively supports development of the B Corp movement here in the UK. Do you feel part of the new generation of connected leaders, and what does that feel like?
I don't know if I feel part of a new generation. I must admit, when I became CEO and started to make connections with different people at that level, I remember, I don't know if Ollie Barrett's in the room. I know he was down to be here. Yeah, Ollie. So I remember being in an event with you and suddenly saying, I feel like I've walked into a room, suddenly a door's opened and I've walked into a room with all these people who care about the things that I care about. And it was tremendously inspiring because I hadn't necessarily met as many of those people sort of as I was sort of progressing through my career. So I think there are a lot of people like that around. I think probably the key that I'm seeing is that I think that connection actually has to start with the connection with yourself. And that connection back into who am I and what's important to me in my life. And I think that certainly when I meet people and speak to people who've gone on this journey, often it's because they've been through some kind of transformative experience themselves that has enabled them to reconnect with themselves, that then sets you to have that different, honest conversation with the world around you.
Okay, I'm just going to pick up, before we move on to Tommy, just on one tweet that I saw, I think it was from today. And it was there's nothing personal in this one, actually. This is something a survey Grant Thornton did. British business, a world leader in optimism, according to a Grant Thornton survey. So one of the most optimistic countries in terms of the way business feels. Are they optimistic for the right reasons, though, in terms of what we're talking about today? Or are they optimistic because profits look good and revenue looks good?
It's a great question. I mean, I think certainly the survey that we did was really in the last quarter, and very much I think that people were being optimistic in terms of sales and profits and revenue. So I think it is still very much defined in the short term, and I think that is a big issue for us because the big important problems to solve aren't necessarily ones that are going to generate profit in the short term. But boy, if we don't sort them out, then the world that we pass on to our children isn't one that I'm going to be proud of.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, Sasha. Tommy Stadlen is refounder of Polaroid. We are going to find out what that means in a minute. And co-author of John's book, Connect. Former McKinsey consultants, worked with President Obama and former British Foreign Secretary David Miliband. Quickly on refounder. Refounder. It's the first time I've heard someone call themselves a refounder. That's because calling yourself a founder, of course, of Polaroid would be very wrong.
That's right. So Polaroid had a fantastic founder in the 1930s and 40s, Edwin Land, Dr. Land, who himself was, I think, one of the original connected leaders. He famously set aside all of Polaroid's production during the war, the Second World War, and said that we have no purpose now except to win the war. And so he was one of the first people to understand that there was a bigger world outside business and his business. So we are refounding Polaroid. We're bringing the great company back to where it was before. We're currently in stealth mode, so this is all very secretive, but watch this space for what we're doing.
But we'll find out when, in March?
Exactly, around March, yeah.
I read in your bio, you're putting purpose at the heart of your business. I mean, it seems a bit jargony, that. What does that actually mean?
So I think in the tech world, we as tech companies have an issue at the moment, because I think the tech companies are transitioning from being the sort of plucky underdogs who we all love and give us great products, to being these huge gargantuan companies who hold all our data, who are messing around with things like artificial intelligence. And I think that we need to define our contribution a lot more clearly, what we're bringing to society, because we need society's trust to be able to bring all these fantastic things to people. And if we don't do that, it will be bad for us, huge value at stake for tech companies, but also there's huge value for society if we're stopped from doing what we need to do.
It's an interesting point, and it's something I'm sure we'll delve into a little bit more. But very quickly, we set up the tech companies as the good guys, i.e. those helping us with the transparency and getting subjects like this on the table. But how easily could the tech companies become the bad guys?
Very easily, and I think in some quarters they already are. If you look at Uber, for example, Uber has a $50 billion valuation. And that $50 billion is predicated on its ability to go city by city all over the world and win these very, very difficult political battles. So if the mayor of Sao Paulo suddenly takes against Uber for whatever reason, or TfL here in London, suddenly try to take against them, that can wipe billions off their valuation. And it might happen because of vested interests, like the taxi industry, or in Airbnb's case, the hotel industry. Or it might happen because there is a groundswell of public opinion that is really genuinely worried about artificial intelligence, or really very worried about privacy. So I think it is happening already.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you. John, let me bring you back into the conversation here. I'd like to look at which, back to your book, which social issues we feel now are most important to society. But let me start with this question. Was there anyone who really surprised you when you were doing your research and your interviews for the book by their complete lack of awareness in this area? And you can name names, as many as you like.
So we interviewed about 100 people. I think some of the interviews were just simply too corporate. You could have read the same thing by reading the annual report. A for consistency, D for interest, I'd say. So we didn't use those. But some people did surprise us, because they went back to a very hard line, which is the only thing I'm interested in is quarterly profits. That's it, and that's the way it's going to be, and nothing should happen except that. We were quite surprised with Eric Schmidt, for example, and his response to things. But it's good to have a variety of responses. And my view of this is this, that it's really important to make money in a business. But I think it's very important to make value too. And value, I think, is very simply the sum of profits, i.e. growth and return, but also over time. And you've got to do it for a period of time. And interestingly, certainly in the businesses I've been involved in, which have been tech and oil and gas and pharmaceuticals and a variety of businesses like that, all of them needed time to get the value. You see this today in the oil and gas business. Mark Carney says, but I'd like to reopen this debate about stranded assets that might be on balance sheets where time may run and you could never extract the value.
Yeah, Helen.
Yeah, no, I suppose I just wanted to comment from the point of view of investment angle, because I think there is this, and this is why one of the points that's so valuable in your book is the McKinsey research showing the actual shareholder value destruction when people get found out. And again, going back to this point that it might seem a little bit cynical to say when it's in people's interest, but I also think the investment that they will change. But the investment community can, but isn't yet, I don't think, compounding or accelerating the speed of change towards a more connected business and society, because as a group, and obviously not talking about wonderful Newton here, but as a group, we are still looking too much at the short term and looking too much at the traditional analytical tools and not thinking actually about sustainable competitive advantage, which does require having a purpose, which does require providing society not just with the goods here and now and profits in the short term, but something meaningful long term. And I'm quite frustrated about it, but I do feel that there is this opportunity again to sow the seeds of faster solution if we could join up these different communities.
Yeah, Tommy?
Yeah, I'm really interested to get your perspective on one thing, Helena, which is in the book we did speak to some people in the finance community who didn't share our views, put it like that. And one of the issues was we looked at the cycles of anti-business sentiment and how they sometimes track downturns in economic cycles. And the view from some people in finance was, well, this is kind of inevitable. When the markets are bad, recessions hit, people hate business. And then there's nothing much you can do about it. Markets come back, people enjoy the good times, and people kind of forget all the outrages of the financial crisis and that kind of thing. From your perspective in finance, how do you lead an organization to not fall into that trap?
Yeah, well, obviously, I'm disappointed but not surprised by this finding, because clearly you could argue that, as I think is pretty self-evident, that economic problems were caused by the self-same people in the businesses. So it's not, the cause and effect thing. I think it's a bit like your CSR challenge, I suppose, in terms of saying it's dead. The businesses have tended again, or investment community has tended to say this is sort of soft ESG specialist areas. Now, I'm very pro ESG, but as in embedding environmental, social, and governance considerations. But it's frustrating to me that people would ever use an excuse rather than wake up. This is an opportunity. This is why I want to try and rephrase the discussion in terms of actually it's not just about protecting what you've got already, but actually, is to your point, Lord Brown, the successful businesses of the future, the successful business leaders of the future will get this.
Yeah, you say it surprises you or disappoints you?
No, it said it disappoints me, but it doesn't surprise me.
Doesn't surprise you,
unfortunately.
Right, yeah. Go ahead.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things I see that drives real sustained business success is when business is solving important problems that are actually valuable in the long term to society. And I think Patagonia is a business that I find fascinating on that front, because that was set up by a climber who was interested in providing equipment to help people climb. And I don't know how many of you know in their business, but even when they found that the pitons that they were using were actually damaging the rocks, that then their major product line, they then just stopped and found something different that didn't damage the rocks. And they have grown from strength to strength and created a new product that wasn't even being used before. So there's something there about, is this opportunity? I think that Helen talks about that when businesses are opening their eyes and thinking about what are the problems we're trying to solve, then out of that comes new growth that's actually much more enriching than just trying to sort of flog a product and extend out from flogging another product.
With which I completely agree. But I think my background is engineering. As an engineer, I'd say this, that business which is founded on engineering principles is very good, but there are limits to what you should do. So if you look at some of the issues to do with tech companies, and I speak from my direct experience being on the board of Intel for a decade with Andy Grove, was everything was moving brilliantly. There were more features, everything worked so well. And I remember asking Andy, do we have a Washington office? And do we think about what we're doing about various things? He said, we make sure our waste is not hazardous. And I said, well, maybe we should worry about our product being a bit hazardous. And nothing happened until one day we suddenly got visited by the Department of Justice, where we'd become too big. And we'd become too big through our success without thinking through the implications of that. And that happens so often. So when you set up a business, you've got to think through, again, what is the agenda that other people have, not what agenda you have. And are they happy with you destroying, it's great to have destructive transformation and stuff like that, but are they happy with it? Are they happy with what you could do with the data? Are they happy with what you can do with AI as it comes along? Yep. Are we happy with the way that different societies build businesses? What do we think about all these things? We've got to have a very proactive agenda.
And John, which social issues do you think will be most important to society in the next few years? And which do you think will have the biggest impact on business value?
Well, I think in our book, towards the end, we talk about a few trends. One is this transformation of the center of gravity of economic activity around the world. It started, at the beginning of the Common Era, somewhere around Turkey, and it migrated right to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and it's right back to somewhere north of Turkey now, and still going east. It will change the way the implied value system of corporations is working, and the ones which make the biggest impact around the world. So we have to recognize and do something about. The second is we picked one item of technology, which is artificial intelligence, and said there is a debate to be had here about the level and extent and boundaries of what will happen with AI. It could be a great thing for society. It could be very destructive. I'm of an age where I remember going to a meeting in the 60s where everyone was anguished about when we had computers working, what would happen to employment and whether there would be any jobs for anybody. I think we understand that that's not an issue. It's a very different issue, which is what sort of jobs and what type of activity people are involved
You know,
in.
I don't want to digress, but this AI piece, and Tommy, I'd be interested to hear your view. Are the Elon Musks of the world and the Stephen Hawkings of the world who are they scaremongering when they say we've got to be really, really careful? I mean, I asked the question because I've done a little bit with various professors on the singularity and whether this will ever come about, and they're extremely skeptical, and they are calling the Elon Musks of the world scaremongers.
Yeah, so I think these are unknown unknowns, basically, because what you're talking about is, can a computer replicate itself and improve itself without mankind helping it along the way? And that sounds like kind of killer robots nonsense, but actually, you know, if you go and speak to Peter Norvig, the director of research at Google, or if you speak to someone like Andy Haldane, the chief economist at the Bank of England, there is a real concern that we do not understand necessarily what we're unleashing. And that could be the kind of killer robots thing. It's probably unlikely. But I think what is more likely is that as we embed artificial intelligence into markets, into healthcare, that when it goes wrong, we don't understand it, it's too complex to put right. And Andy Haldane, for example, gave the example of the flash crash in 2010 with the high-frequency trading problems, where essentially no economist, no regulator would be able to look at algorithms which are moving so quickly and changing themselves so quickly, you wouldn't know where the problem was. And so essentially all you can do is turn it off.
So in the third thing we covered was some of the great challenges of the future and where value destruction could take place and what corporations had to focus on. And they were everything from obesity, which changes the very nature of the food industry, to things like AI and in particular things like the engineering of climate change, which is a real major problem for which there is no direct solution at the moment.
Sasha, why are we talking so much more about this now, would you say?
I think suddenly I see that there is a generation of leaders who look at the world that we're actually going to pass on to our children and actually feel deeply embarrassed that we will not have been addressing issues that were fundamentally important. And, you know, sometimes that's really brought home to me. We were doing some scenario planning about the future into sort of 2028, and I had at home all of these different posters, and my then 10-year-old son walked into the room, and he sort of stood and looked at them all, and he goes, "So you didn't think climate change and the fact that actually we're going to have global warming and half the islands in the world are going to disappear was worth mentioning on your review of the future, did you?" In this very sort of know-it-all way. But that's how they see it. And so I think that is actually driving a lot of the stuff of actually saying there is really big, important stuff that's right in front of our faces and we need to do something about it.
When you talk to your family and when you talk to your peers, do you think more along those lines, or do you think more along the lines of I'm going to save my business 30% if I do the right thing?
Probably more on the lines of the former,
Yeah.
and knowing that actually doing business well also has a positive business benefit. Equally, there are many colleagues in my business that are persuaded the other way around. To be honest, I don't really care which way they get to it, as long as they get to it.
Yeah. How about you, Helen?
Well, I think I'd have a foot in both camps. I have a vested interest in the next generation, not least with my large family, but also going back to Laura Brown's point about the transparency and the leadership. You know, you don't get the benefit of being a leader without earning really living and breathing it. People can see everything that you're doing. You made the point that 20 years ago, I mean, being the CEO was a completely different thing. But even 5 years ago, we didn't have. I mean, most people weren't on Twitter then, and I just think that gives a good mirror up to ourselves. I don't think it changes how we should always have been, but I am hoping that we break the cycle that John talks about over and over again. I mean, there are some very historical examples that you use of businesses doing the wrong thing by society. And if we do have this, it's like it is a one-off, but it's not one-off because it's always going to be with us. I mean, technology is not going to be uninvented. But it really does change what it takes, I think, to be a good leader.
Okay, and we'll come on to that, the how, in a second. I know, John, you've said your book isn't about solutions, it's about debate, but I'd like to look at the how, what we need to change. But let me ask you this: there was a great piece in The Economist. I don't know if any of you saw it, and it asked whether CSR. So we're coming on to this, specifically CSR now, and tax minimization go together. My question, I guess, to you, and let me start with you, John, is where is the line for you? What line can't you cross if you want to stay a good, connected leader?
The most important thing is not trying to explain what you're doing in a more favorable light than it deserves. So I think, if you're not paying tax because you're a corporation set up that way, you should say so, explain why, and be very clear from the beginning. Do not be discovered doing it.
Yeah.
Actually say what you're doing. And I think that's a good start.
Okay,
but I think the most important thing is don't try and spin it or make a failure into a success or hide something away.
Let me ask it this way, and this is very much with my journalist hat on, and this is in no way an ambush, but you are on the board of Huawei.
Absolutely.
There's been some controversy with that company, especially in the United States.
I think you're understating it.
Okay. How do you explain that with a connected leader hat on?
Very simply, because first of all, they make great products, and actually they are serving 40 of the 45 telcos in the world. So there's a big controversy in the US about whether or not it's a direct line to the People's Liberation Army of China. I think evidence shows that's not the case. Rather more importantly, there's a process for transparent examination of what they're doing in the UK with the UK government. I'm on the board of the UK subsidiary to make sure that actually it is governed in a way which is transparent and clear. Its bulk of its business as it goes forward, of course, will be to compete with Apple with smartphones.
Right.
And that, I think, is not controversial.
So an individual, a leader, a connected leader, has his or her own standards which they set. Would you say that?
Yeah, I think
And what are yours? What's the line you wouldn't cross?
Well, I suppose in a general point, it's going back to this, am I comfortable that I'm saying the truth?
Yeah.
Is it actually what I believe? Is there a seamlessness? I mean, I think that when we're running businesses and when we're looking into ourselves, you made the very good point at the beginning, Sasha, that it should be like a stick of rock. Wherever you cut it, it's exactly the same imprint. And that for me is then when you're being authentic and you deserve the right to lead then.
Sasha?
I think for me, it's actually that we once said in our code of conduct, it was almost we shouldn't need a code of conduct. It was whatever you were doing, would you be proud if your mother or father was looking over your shoulder or if your children were looking at what you're doing? And I still think that's a pretty good edict of, if you said to your children or your family, I'm doing this, would they feel proud or would they feel embarrassed and feel they have to cover it up? And I think that's a helpful rule of thumb for me.
Okay. And quickly from you, Tommy.
Yeah, I just think being authentic and being honest. I think I gave a talk about this book to the London School of Economics. I asked how many people trust business leaders to tell the truth, and not a single person in the whole audience said yes. And I think that's partly because when you look at TV and you see CEOs, they're not really speaking normal language, and there's a kind of disconnect between the truth and what they're saying. Yeah. So I think you can just try and be a bit honest and open.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get on to this point of CSR, the practice of CSR being dead. Let me first ask you whether you three agree with that point. I mean,
I think it's outlived its.
Okay.
We start off with having a focus on something, and then it should become part of daily life.
So it was sort of used as a sort of token tool, was it, CSR?
Well, I think not necessarily token, but actually
Transformative tool in the beginning.
20,
30 years ago, maybe.
But no longer serving its purpose. What can we do to the CSR function, or what needs to happen to the CSR function to make it valuable again, would you say?
Personally, I think that it's this whole thing about making things integral to your business purpose. And when I look at our business, I think, well, what are the different ways in which we can influence? We can influence through who we work with, through what we do with them, through what we stand out, speak out about, and for how we are as a business. And there are specific skills that can be helpful, particularly in the how we are as a business, to make sure that purpose is absolutely lived through. But I think it needs to be really embedded in that construct rather than something that's doing something nice on the side. And so it becomes really about how to be a sustainable business going forward.
And
in the future.
is Grant Thornton making those moves?
Yeah.
You are really embedding it. You're
So I mean, since I took up, I mean, the last 2 partner meetings have largely been taken up with actually sort of really saying, well, you know, if we didn't exist, why would we be created? What do we stand for? How do we then live that purpose in everything we do? And that now is being used to really sort of transform and reshape through our whole business, through to which clients we serve, to what we do with them, to what we speak out on, and to, you know, some things of, well, if we really mean this, how does that mean we need to be as a business? And we made some really quite bold changes in that stance. So, for example, becoming a shared enterprise, saying, well, actually, we really mean that actually we think that the route to a vibrant economy is through everybody participating. Then how do we live that in our organisation? Well, that's through everybody participating. So it's quite a lot of soul searching. We're certainly not there yet. But it's a really interesting journey to explore.
And Tommy, same question to you, but let me ask it this way. John mentioned Howard Davies talking, mentioning this being talked about for 30 minutes on a Friday afternoon. Are you talking about CSR, about these issues for more than 30 minutes on a Friday afternoon? And are you intentionally trying to talk about it every day at very senior levels within your organisation?
So definitely. And part of that is because if you don't have a purpose-driven organisation, you simply can't hire the best people, I find. But I think, I'll give you an example. It's not just CSR, it's the legal department, for example. So Spotify, the music streaming service, they changed their terms of use. You know, you download an app or you go on the internet and you have a website and you have terms of use. Everyone ignores it. Except Spotify changed it and everyone went nuts. And this amazing brand they built up was suddenly put at risk overnight because they were messing around with privacy and they were changing things. And the leadership had no idea this had happened. And it was purely because they farmed it out to the legal team and saw something which was a key brand issue and saw it as a legal issue. And so for us, for example, when we're thinking about terms of use, that's something that the leadership of the company has to deal with and has to take responsibility for.
Why, John, why is it so difficult to really see CSR professionals at a higher level in an organization, hire the right people, pay them the right amount of money? Why has it taken so long, and why is it still not happening?
It's, I think, part of a silo effect. So I think, in effect, what we have to do, and my book doesn't have formula, but it has some proposals for some things that could be done practically. One of which is very important, is to produce proper professional managerial techniques here. One of which must be to develop people in the line of the business with an awareness of what they need to look at. And they don't necessarily need to do it, but they need to be really aware right across the board. And as I quoted in my remarks, most executives think that at best 20% of the people are skilled to do that. Yep. That doesn't mean that they can't do it, it just means that nobody's attended to it to get the skilling up in the right places. And that skilling has to take place.
I was given some statistics, some data ahead of this session, which talked about salaries and average basic pay for CSR professionals, and this is from ACRE, a sustainability, CR and a sustainability salary survey. Average total remuneration for an individual controlling a budget of about £1 million was about £120,000. It's not moving up. Are salaries like that high enough per se, would you say, John, for the skill set needed to manage the 30% variation that you talk about?
So in front of this audience, I have to say, of course not. Otherwise, but I think, you know, it's about standing, actually. It's about role. And it seems to me the right formula is the following. First, the line has to clearly understand what's going on in this area and primarily do it. The CSR people are almost educators, advisors, if you will. They need to be at a position where they can enforce that with heads of business units, which means few but very important people. And whatever they get paid is a function, I think, of the scale of the company and what a BU leader gets paid, I would say.
One of the problems, I think, with a lot of this and why we're not making faster progress is because we made incremental changes around an existing sort of framework for running businesses. We haven't stood back, although you can when you're refounding a company perhaps, and saying, actually, how would we run it if we're setting up today? And actually, I mean, I think it counts for a lot of functions. Like, I think HR should be massively upgraded, people before strategy. That, if we were to do CSR but more embedded, you need real leadership there. So I think that's part of the problem, and recognizing it as a first step to perhaps doing something more radical, having a revolution, not an evolution about it.
You are recognizing that, aren't you?
Yeah, no, well, obviously we have an existing business as well. So again, it's slightly frustrating sometimes when you're obviously not wanting to destroy good things that work well. But yes, re-engineering so that you've got people right at the heart of or at the top of the organization who are driving these issues is the only way forward.
And the existing business argument, is that often used as an excuse, would you say?
I think, yeah, we use the word excuse a couple of times. And I think, yes, people often are sort of saying, well, how? I mean, this Friday afternoon, I was once speaking on a sort of diversity panel, and a guy actually genuinely put up his hand and said, how would we fit it into the day? Is it something to do on Tuesdays or half a day a week? Or, I mean, genuinely, this was, not just an apocryphal thing. He was asking, I thought he was asking in a sort of slightly facetious way, but it was a serious question. How many hours a week should we be diverse and inclusive? So, I think it just comes down to that I believe that we won't connect with our clients unless we change or keep evolving or keep getting ahead of all these issues.
Maybe this has happened, and forgive me if it hasn't, but yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
It makes the point, I think, that you have to be consistent with what you say. So a leader should say what she or he believes, but I believe what they must believe is that their business has to be connected with society. They need to say it and do something about it. So to Helene's point, it's most of my peers, when I was running BP, and still today, most of CEOs will say that, when pushed, their human resource is the most important asset they have. If you actually look at their diary and their time allocation, you would not believe that, because the minority of time is spent on that, and a statement like the most important asset would imply the majority. So this is about time allocation, and that means priorities, and people need to sort them out properly.
Yeah, Tommy.
Just very briefly on the time point. So we're obsessed with the number 30%. So 30% of value at stake.
Good number, yeah.
Great number, 30%. So 30% of value at stake, and 30% of CEOs reporting success at this.
Yeah.
But there's another stat, which is that there are CEOs report spending 30% of their time on this issue, on societal connection, not necessarily with their people,
right.
Which is actually quite high.
That's their target, is it? Or they are?
No, that's what they are.
Really?
But
Only
not doing enough.
30% of 30%.
Oh,
Spend
okay.
30%.
So pretty small.
Very small.
Just very quickly, have you reached 30% of the 30% club yet?
No, 26 and
26,
a bit.
okay. We're not going to talk about that this evening. And Helena mentioned the privileged position, I guess you're in, you're refounding a company, a great company. Does that mean you can pick a very senior person and pay them bloody well and put them in a CR role right at the top?
I think what you need is people right at the top who understand this issue and who are trained in it. I think it's very simple. Well, so I think I've got 2 out of the 3. So there's something called a tri-sector athlete. It's a kind of McKinsey term, a tri-sector athlete. And what you want is someone who has experience in the private sector, in the government sector, and in the social sector. Mm-hmm. I've got 2 out of the 3, so I'm not perfect. I'm moving my way there one day, maybe. But I think when we talk about integrating societal and environmental considerations into the core of the business, I think you need to integrate those issues into the core of a person as well. And to try and there's actually not many people in business who have experience in the social sector or have experience in the government sector.
Go ahead, Sasha.
Yeah, well, I just find it interesting in terms of the whole sort of hiring ACR person on the board. I think we're still sort of putting a bubble. I think the point of it, I mean, I see my role as CEO is that my job is to make sure that we've got those lines through the stick of rock and that everyone in our organisation has got that understanding of what we're trying to achieve and is enabled to collaborate and make things happen. And you know, I have some of the team in our sustainability team. We have a tiny team in terms of sustainability. We have 4 people in there. Their job is to enable the things that we think are really important to do at a firm-wide level that we want to stand out on, to enable those things to happen. But it's very much an enabler for us to live our purpose, rather than saying without them our purpose wouldn't happen, because then I think we'd have it the wrong way round. I'm looking at Daniel to see if you nod or not. Yeah.
What other, again, I know that the book, as John said, doesn't come up with solutions per se, but what other solutions, like rejigging CSR or putting it in a different place, can we come up with?
Well, I think a lot of this ties back, and I'm sorry, but I've waited until now to mention it, that we've had a very homogenous group of people at the top of organisations, and I think the push towards more diverse organisation and other perspectives and connecting with more types of people is a big part of the solution. I think that we can use the push that we're seeing now on diversity and inclusion in organisations to enhance and accelerate the progress in this area. Because I just think otherwise we're going around in circles with people sort of, you know, agreeing with each other and being used to behaving in a certain way.
Yeah. Because of the headway you've made in that area, 30% club, etc., do you find that you've built a momentum that allows you then to succeed in other areas?
You mean me personally, or just the
you personally, but the business that you run.
I think, where I see it is, I think that in this case, obviously, I mean, gender diversity is not the be-all and end-all, but it's a good place to start. The women or feminine qualities are slightly different to masculine qualities, and often you see just another type of issue brought to the table, another type of discussion. So, I mean, my own board, which now has 3 women out of 11, so almost 30%. You know, again, I see a different set of considerations. A lot is about, and there has been research, I'm sure McKinsey's did it, because they always have, around how boards that have a bigger representation of women on them actually do take these issues more seriously. And it's not that I don't think men can, I just think that we need to change the dialogue, and actually one thing can lead to another. We can create a nice chain reaction.
I want to come back to a point that I mentioned right at the top when I was talking to Helena, and this is the risk that leaders have to take to get to the right place ultimately. And we've on this stage before spoken with Unilever, and we've talked about Paul Polman, and we've talked about the way he and others, Tim Cook I think is one of them, have spoken to institutional investors in particular, and the message they've given institutional investors. And they've taken risks, I would say, and in spreading that message to the investor, because of course when things go wrong, or if numbers don't look good, they've got a very good reason to come back to the CEO and say, you're doing the wrong thing. How much, John, of an obstacle is something like the institutional investor and the power the institutional investor has, the short-term investor?
Well, I've always found that speaking to investors and explaining what your real purpose is and putting it in the timescales that you've got is a winning way. They're not particularly interested in saying, but tell me what the quarterly profit is. Sell-side analysts might. It's great for the financial press, but actually real investors look at you for long-term value generation and credibility. The credibility of getting that done. And so I think that's exactly what you've got to do. But you know, being a CEO is not an administrative position. It's not something you go into and say, you know, how do I take no risk to make sure that, you know, if things go wrong, I don't get blamed. I mean, that would be an appalling idea. Mm-hmm. You know, CEOs are there to take well-judged risks. And you're appointed to that position, in my view, when people who make that appointment realize that you've got the judgment to take those risks. And that's the important thing, because otherwise there is no return. Yeah. You know, no risk, there is no return.
Who do you think is? We've mentioned the Paul Polmans and the Elon Musks and the Richard Bransons. Who do you think is? Anyone? Throw some names out. Who's doing it particularly well right now?
I'd chuck out Rose Macario at Patagonia.
Yep.
And I just think everything, if you get a chance to Google, if you don't know her story, if you get a chance to Google it and read some of the choices they've made as a business that absolutely mean they're more successful as a business, but they're actually making choices that are incredibly good for the planet as well. It's quite inspiring.
In financial services, okay, we've got Helena Morrissey, but who else in financial services is doing it
Nigel
well?
Wilson, Legal & General.
Okay.
I mean, if we go to domestic play, I mean, he definitely lives and breathes it. Everything that they do, I think it's about, good business for society, and I think there's no disconnect at all with what he says and what they do.
Is he suffering in some way as a result
No,
of
I think
having
back
that
to John's
stance?
point that actually they're respected. He's respected. I mean, you don't always win quarter in, quarter out, but I think there is a respect that comes that, again, long-term investors, it's our job to encourage our clients, asset owners, to give us a long-term mandate so we can take the long view. But if we believe, with much more respect for a business that comes with a vision, a leader that comes with a vision and the discipline to stick to it, obviously, nothing stays the same and to adapt as events unfold, but to actually know where they're going. I mean, that's much more powerful than just, saying what people want to hear.
And in tech, and I'd like to come back to tech more generally in a moment, but in tech, yes, we've mentioned a few of them, but who else inspires you in this area?
I think tech's such a rich area for role models because I think you've got a unique set of circumstances where you get very young founders of these huge companies like Uber and Airbnb and so on. They're very young. They own massive chunks of the company. They're often private companies, so you don't have to necessarily answer to short-term shareholders, and you're incentivized to think about the long-term growth of the company. And you also get people who are not necessarily trained to manage, as John is saying. They're CEOs who don't manage, they lead, and they are thinking about the issues which enact the core purpose of the business. So it's full of great examples. Elon Musk, Aaron Levy at Box. I think the Google guys, the two guys who founded Google, are fantastic at what they've done.
And back to the danger in tech. The good guys very easily, you say, becoming or capable of becoming the bad guys. What worries you most in your space, in the tech space,
I think
in terms of connecting society with business?
So I think the single biggest issue which will define the relationship between business and society in the next 10 years is artificial intelligence, because I think it has the most potential for good. It can transform medicine, it can transform cars, and it can stop 1 million people dying a year on the roads. But it also has the biggest potential for harm, obviously. And it's so misunderstood, and I think that we might be sleepwalking a little bit into a similar situation we had in the financial crisis.
You say harm, in what way do you mean harm?
So, for example, if you take the flash crash of 2010, things like that. If you get artificial intelligence in markets and in healthcare, there's a lot of risk there.
What about AI computers taking over not just blue-collar jobs, but white-collar jobs as well, in professions like the legal profession?
Yeah, just one quick stat on that. So there's some research from my former colleagues at McKinsey, which is that 45% of all the activities that people are paid for in the US can be replaced, automated by existing technology today. And that's about $3 trillion worth of wages. So it's here.
Is that good or bad?
Really scary and really bad
scary.
for the people
really
who
bad
do those
for
jobs.
society, right?
Changes
Potentially.
society.
Yeah,
It
changes the
simply
whole
changes
dynamic,
society.
right?
There's a wonderful video, if you want to Google it, Humans Need Not Apply,
Yeah.
which actually does the analogy between human beings and horses as in at the turn of the century when the cars came in, and actually how they looked at it. And I think there is a risk that we do become the Luddite horses, who think that actually without actually harnessing technology in a really purposeful way, that if we don't do that, that suddenly there will be other jobs for us. Well, maybe there won't be, and I think we need to be quite thoughtful about that.
I'm going to open it up to the floor for some questions in a moment, but let me get a final comment from each of you. Again, it's something Helena touched on at the beginning, and it was, I guess the question has to be, if all of this is so obvious, why are there not many more connected leaders like yourselves out there? John, let me start with you.
Well, first, there may well be, and they may well develop. And that's, I think, what my hope is that by thinking what you have to do to make a business really greatly successful, by connecting with society, it influences the way people are developed, trained and educated. And that's actually what has to happen, is people have to reflect on their experience, change the way they behave, and that has to be facilitated by training and development. Because that's actually the managerial solution, if you will, to many of the proposals in the book. It's about training managers and executives to do something different. So I think that's the purpose. I think the big thing is look at the responsiveness of society to things that go wrong and how quickly you can destroy, you can get to the point of an existential threat faster than you could ever have got to last year, the year before. And it's going to get faster. So you better do something about it. And that, I think, will be the catalyst for the change.
Tommy?
I think we need to reframe it all as a business question. I know that everyone in this room has been doing it since the Green Monday days when I used to come here, but I still think at the heart of business, a lot of people see this issue as a fluffy issue, as not as a hard business issue. So I think if we all have a job to do to communicate that this is 30% of the value at stake in the company. It's a serious business issue.
But again, the function itself needs to be repositioned as a hard, serious issue, right?
Absolutely, and I think we need people who care about this in the C-suite as well as in the sustainability centre.
Yeah. Sasha?
I'd sort of frame it in that I think we're still operating in a paradigm of leadership that is this alpha leadership where it's all about winning. And the definition of winning has been defined by sort of economics that's prevailed over the last 50 years of a certain paradigm, that it's all about shareholder value. And I think it's that needs redefining, because when you actually move away that and say actually the real sort of value in leadership is about what you can create that's sustainable to live beyond you, then actually everything else sort of realigns and falls into place. And so I think that's why actually I think so much the work about diversity is so important, because what it's really challenging is that we have a model of leadership which is very alpha, which values a certain set of characteristics that are seen as typically male characteristics, and that limited view is actually very damaging for our planet.
And Helena?
Well, I guess to build on that, because I was going to say something a little bit similar, but I think it's all, it needs to move from a sort of nice to have for this generation of leaders to must have to attract the best talent. Someone made the point earlier that actually, I think it was you, Tommy, that you won't get the next generation of really talented individuals applying to join your companies. I did speak at not Grant Thornton, and a big accountancy firm, and I arrived and they were ashen faces on diversity, and I said, what's the matter? It's a little while ago, and they said, well, we went to present to a prospect, a really big client potentially, and we were asked to leave the room before we sat down. And I said, why? And they said, well, because it turned out, we were all white, all male, all a certain age, and they said, you didn't read the brief, we wanted to connect. And I said, well, didn't you read the brief? And they said, well, there was this one woman who was going to show up with us as part of the team, but she was off sick that day. And it really hit them. It really hit the bottom line. And it comes down to, again, going back to business leaders, at the moment, talk about it, but I don't think they do stuff because they don't really believe that until it hits them in the face.
Are you optimistic, John?
Yes, I am. I am. I mean, I agree with, I want to come back to the last thing I said, that actually when you begin to get inclusion right, you begin to open up all sorts of possibilities. And I slowly begin to see that coming right. It's not just about a gender, it's about sexuality, a thing I've been very focused on, which I think is a bit tougher problem. But all these things all point in the right direction. Now, constant vigilance is needed, big economic downturn, people say, well, that's all off, let's do something different. It requires care, but I'm actually very optimistic.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Right.